Representative Matt Bradford, PA House Majority Leader, the deadline for the state budget has come and gone. Some lawmakers don't mind that. How do you feel about it?
Well, I would honestly prefer to get it done by the end of the fiscal year, but the test of the product is the substance, not the timeliness. And I think we all recognize that as we continue to work through this process, that we need to come up with a budget that does what the governor proposed, which is make historic investments in education, deal with the Commonwealth Court ruling. Obviously, there's an opportunity with our huge surpluses to deal with our competitiveness as a Commonwealth in terms of taxation. So this is a pretty complex budget year, but it's a budget year where optimistically we can do big things.
What are the consequences, Representative, if any, of missing the budget deadline?
You know, the reality is because of a court case a few years back, there's very little, which unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because frankly, people should make deadlines because they should make deadlines, removed a lot of the pressure that used to exist. So there used to be the issue of making sure that the state payroll was made. That created an urgency that sometimes is missing from the process. Again, I believe in the urgency of the process. I believe we should make sure the end of the fiscal year is when we wrap it up. But I think the good news is the governor said, I believe yesterday, that we're in the red zone. Whether we're at the 5-yard line or the 20-yard line, the end zone is in sight, and there's an opportunity to pass a really historic budget that does big things for the Commonwealth. And we need to get about doing that.
So tell us what remains to be worked out before the budget goes to the governor's desk.
That seems like a simple question, but the answer really is nothing's agreed on until everything's agreed on. The budget is the sum of its parts. Some of those parts are more controversial than others, but I think we're making decent progress on all the component parts of what should be a final budget.
Well, Representative, how does your caucus feel about the governor's proposal to raise education by $1 billion? Let's start there.
We're ecstatic about it. And by the way, it's not just the governor's proposal. It's a constitutional mandate that has been affirmed by the Commonwealth Court. We have an obligation not just to fund education in Pennsylvania, but to fund education equitably. And when you look at the just insane taxation that goes in some of our most underfunded school districts that not only struggle to educate their kids, but put a crushing tax blow onto their citizens. We need to reverse that trend. We have this opportunity because of the court case, the imperative, but because of our financial situation, the resources to deal with it.
Now, with respect to education funding, Republicans are saying that spending too much could damage Pennsylvania's financial standing. How do you respond to them?
I think it's absurd. And you don't have to just take it from me. Take it from the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School, which just did a study this past week, not only laying out the moral imperative to make sure that every child receives an appropriate and equal education in the Commonwealth, but the economic impact. The reality of a more skilled, more trained, highly trained workforce in terms of wages, in terms of their future benefit, what they will then contribute back to the Commonwealth. The ripple effect that it will have throughout our economy, not just in the years that we make these investments, but for the generations of a more trained, more skilled, more qualified workforce. By the way, we want that for every one of our children. We should want it for every children of the Commonwealth. So that type of argument, which was raised, frankly, in the Commonwealth Court case, one of the most disheartening comments I've ever heard in my time in the legislature was the attorneys for the respondents, in this case, the legislative leaders at the time on the Republican side, who literally said some of these kids are literally on the Burger King track, that they don't need the skills that may come with math and science. Listen, one can argue that there needs to be a track and a path for every child, but the idea that every child isn't guaranteed and won't be provided the best education possible is an absurdity. It is heartbreaking, and I don't know how anybody in this day and age can look at the inequities in our school system and defend it.
Representative, give us a little more context on the court ruling you've alluded to a couple times. That ruling came down. It found, at least in simple terms, that Pennsylvania's method for funding education was unconstitutional, but it didn't seem to contain any detail after that. What did you get out of it?
Yeah, our state constitution, Larry, written in the late 60s, provided that every child in the Commonwealth was guaranteed an equitable and appropriate public education. That was not, frankly, the history of where our Commonwealth has been. We've been falling woefully short of that. The Commonwealth Court, and I'm an attorney by trade, and I certainly don't believe there's Democrat and Republican judges, but I will mention that the president of Commonwealth Court who wrote the decision, the historic decision, is a Republican, was elected as a Republican. And she's the one who acknowledged that the way we fund the impact on students, on property taxes, and on the Commonwealth as a whole was unconstitutional and did not live up to that constitutional obligation. And you're right, Larry, that court did not propose how to go about a better funding formula. It frankly threw it upon the legislature as part of this budget process to deal with it, to give us an opportunity as the elected representatives of this Commonwealth to come up with the way to heal our funding system. We've proposed that, a funding system that makes sure that every school district in the Commonwealth will receive more funding, will continue to see more funding, but we will deal with those schools that are inadequately and inequitably funding. We will bring them up to par and make sure that not only those students are treated right, but those property taxpayers are dealt with some level of equity and fairness so those communities can grow, those students can thrive, and we remove the stigma of overtaxed and inferior education that currently burdens some of those communities in the current system.
So, Representative, to your last point, is there anything in the budget that ensures the districts that need the funding the most will get it?
Absolutely. Again, the budget's not final, but what we are working on, what we are demanding is that we not only make those funds go to the right districts, the most inequitably funded, the most highest taxed, make sure that these funds are targeted directly towards those districts that have been stigmatized. But we want to make sure through a formula that is guaranteed, and we want accountability metrics. And we're willing to work with all four caucuses and our governor to make sure that we deal with that so that these districts not only provide for those kids, but also deal with the tax burden that's been put off on these taxpayers who've been harnessed with this unbelievable burden for too long.
Now, the governor wants to stretch spending for education, the education increase that is, over a span of 7 years, I understand. Why do it that way?
Frankly, because it's a huge ramp up and the governor wants to be prudent. Listen, I wish we had done it 70 years ago. Listen, we've been talking about equity and adequacy of education literally since the days of the Brown decision 70 some years ago. We recognize that certain school districts in our Commonwealth are underfunded and we need to bring them up. And we're not going to do that in one budget year. We're going to do it over several years. The governor's proposal was 7 years. Whatever that final number is, we have an obligation to do it forthwith with all due speed. Frankly, it's 70 years too late. 7 years is probably too long for some of us who are anxious to get it done yesterday. But we recognize there's economic realities and we need to deal with that. That's the prudency and pragmatism of governing.
So let's talk about funding for private and religious schools, also known as school vouchers. And the governor has his own name for the program, PASS. He calls it PASS. And as you know, Representative, the school vouchers debate flared up about this time of year last year. Do you expect that to come up again in the near future before this budget is settled?
Well, Larry, I've been unbelievably clear. I'm not in favor of using public tax dollars to fund private schools. Now, having said that, we have a robust tax credit program, the EITC program, the OSTC program. But what I've also said, and what I think every listener should hear, is we are open to every and any idea about helping poor kids in poor schools. And that's not just rhetoric, that is reality. If you want to talk about alternatives, if you want to talk about resources, if you want to talk about helping those children, but we need to help every children in every underfunded, under-resourced, stigmatized school district. And whether that is through a scholarship program or any other idea that's out there, it needs to meet a very simple test that our first constitutional obligation is that we fund and appropriately support public education in this Commonwealth.
How about cyber charter schools, Representative? There's debate about reducing funding for cyber charters. And what is your caucus's position here?
Yeah, Larry, I don't support defunding any level of education, period, full stop. What I don't support, though, is frankly a system of reimbursement that does not actually correlate with the amount of expense that is created in educating a child. There needs to be accountability metrics. We hear it a lot from the critics of public education, but it needs to also be true for alternatives. It needs to be true for our private schools, for our charter schools, and yes, our cyber and cyber charter schools. The idea that we're going to reimburse at a rate that is not commensurate with what is being spent per child, that is just an absurdity to me. That has created a windfall. But God bless the Inquirer recently did a series of stories about the huge windfalls that these districts have resulted, or these cyber charter schools have resulted. Listen, these are not money-making, asset-growing endeavors. These are about educating children. And again, we are open to every idea when it comes to educating children. But if you think you should be getting rich off of educating kids or siphoning dollars out of our public school system, I don't think we're going to agree.
During this budget cycle, Representative, is there anything in sight that could reduce the cost of higher education?
Absolutely. Listen, Pennsylvania has a not the greatest track record, but we just talked about K-12 education. Sadly, it's also true about support for higher education. The current PASHE system, which is our primary state education system that we control at the state level, we are, depending on whose numbers you use, somewhere in the low 40s in terms of support for higher education. As a consequence, some of those schools continue to struggle, some of them because of geography, some of them for demographic reasons that are affecting every school. But some of those schools struggle in the Commonwealth because Pennsylvania makes higher education very, very expensive for our students. We need to make the pathway to education, the pathway to the PASHE schools, more affordable. And I want to sound a note of bipartisanship. I actually appreciate the Republican Education Chairman, Representative Topper. I appreciate what some of my Senate Republican colleagues have talked about creating scholarships specifically for Pennsylvania kids to go to Pennsylvania schools and to stay and grow and invest and create a career and a livelihood in Pennsylvania. And by the way, cynically, to pay back in terms of taxes and support for this Commonwealth long term. That is the type of conversation we need to have. That is good, smart public policy. We can do that by making college more affordable, by saddling these kids with less debt and giving them more reason to stay, grow, and prosper here in the Commonwealth.
We only have about a minute left, Representative. How would you compare progress on budget negotiations this year with last year's?
You know, I know it's been largely quiet this year. You know, Larry, I know you mentioned like the deadline and stuff, and rightfully so. But I will tell you, you haven't had the public demonstrable issues that you had last year. This has been a very smooth process, largely. I think, you know, there's quite a few leaders, myself included, a new governor. I think we're all getting into a good pace. I think we're doing a good job here. Listen, there are very strong disagreements, and there's going to be strong disagreements before we close this out. There are still some very big issues that we need to come to close on. But I think doing that respectfully and frankly, sometimes in hushed tones and in quiet moments is better than the public spectacle, which drives people further apart. At a time where our politics have become overly poisonous, I think we've demonstrated that we can govern well. I think our governor has set a tone of bipartisanship and competence. I often joke that his ideology is competence, and that is a trend that I think all four caucuses would be wise to engage and follow his lead on.
Representative Matt Bradford, PA House Majority Leader, thank you.
Thank you, Larry.